During the special company dinner, I sent the divorce letter to my wife and her lover's table, and saw in her eyes the astonishment of someone who hadn't expected to be elegantly unmasked. I stood up silently, left the ring next to the glass, and left. "Now you can toast to the freedom you've both been searching for," I whispered before leaving. The entire room fell silent for a brief second that seemed to freeze time. No one dared say anything. There was no scandal, no shouting, no humiliation, only the weight of the truth, so clear, so irrefutable, that a calm gesture was enough to implode everything she thought was hidden. And I left. Unhurriedly. Without looking back. Because right there, in that moment, I already knew, what united us no longer existed. She just didn't know I knew. She just didn't imagine I would have the strength to face the mirror and tell myself that love, when it turns into a knife, needs to be removed from the chest before it kills from within. And that's exactly what I did. The strangest thing is that all of this had been building for months. The silence, the distant glances, the repeated apologies with the same rehearsal tone, the cancelled dinners, the cell phones face down, the deleted messages, the smell of different perfume on freshly laundered clothes, the easy laughter with strangers, and the coldness with those who were once home. Everything inside me begged for a credible lie, something to tell me I was exaggerating, that it was paranoia, that love still lived there, suffocated perhaps, tired, but alive. But it wasn't. It was dead. And what killed me most was knowing the funeral had gone ahead without me being invited. It took me a while to accept it. Because those who love, deny. Because those who love, try. And I tried. More times than she could count. I hid dark circles under my eyes with coffee, pain with work, tears with rain. I smiled in public and died in silence. I even thought the problem was me. That maybe I'd stopped being interesting. That I'd stopped being man enough. That I'd become invisible in her eyes, while someone out there lit the spark that I, without realizing it, let go. But no. The truth is, she wanted more. She wanted freedom. She wanted something new. She wanted to feel desired again by someone who didn't know her fears, her flaws, her traumas. She wanted to pretend to be someone else. And to do that, she had to kill the one who knew the truest version of her. I remember exactly the day I knew for sure. It wasn't a photo, nor a message. It was the scent of disinterest. The way she looked at me when I entered the room and told her I missed her. The automatic way she replied, "Me too," without even looking at me. It was like kissing a ghost. Sleeping next to an absence. Being married to someone who was already somewhere else, emotionally, physically, morally. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to be a supporting character in my own marriage. That I didn't deserve to live in a movie where the happy ending was reserved for two other characters and I was just the obstacle to be removed. I started planning. Not revenge. I never wanted revenge. I wanted dignity. I wanted to look in the mirror and feel proud of myself. I wanted to walk out the door with my head held high, without having to yell, hit, expose, or humiliate. I didn't want her to pay. I wanted her to realize, in her own time, what she'd thrown away. I wanted silence to speak for me. I wanted absence to hurt more than any imposed presence. And that's exactly what happened. The letter was written calmly. Sharp words, no hate, no drama, just truths. No direct accusations, no dates, no names. Because I knew she would understand every line, every comma, every silence between one sentence and the next. I knew she would read it like someone listening to a sad song they already knew but didn't want to admit it touched them deeply. At the end of the letter, a sentence, "May the freedom you so longed for embrace you with the same intensity with which you gave up our love." I placed the letter in an elegant white envelope, with no return address. And I took it with me to dinner. The company dinner was symbolic. It was the end-of-year party. The celebration of another cycle. Everyone was there. Including him. Her lover. The same one who pretended to greet me in the hallways, who smiled when he passed me as if I were just another teammate. She was beautiful. She was radiant. The kind of glow only those experiencing forbidden love carry in their eyes. I watched. I sat at the table with other colleagues, greeted, laughed, was kind. I waited for the right moment. When I saw them both smiling, exchanging glances, toasting with glasses of sparkling wine, I stood up. I walked to their table, placed the envelope between them, took the ring off my finger, and left it next to her glass. She looked at me, confused. She opened the envelope and began to read. Her smile slowly faded. He read it too. He turned pale. I simply said, without raising my voice, "Now you can toast to the freedom you've been searching for so long." And I left. That was the end. The end of her with me. The end of what we once were. But it wasn't my end. It was my new beginning. The following days were difficult. The pain didn't disappear immediately. But peace began to appear. First slowly, then more strongly. I began to wake up with more ease. To eat without feeling the bitter taste of betrayal. To walk around the house without avoiding rooms. To listen to music without changing the station. And it was in this process that I met someone. Someone who didn't arrive to replace. Who arrived to add. Who didn't ask for proof, simply offered presence. Who didn't invade my space, simply stayed where there was room. Who valued every detail, every silence, every laugh, every attempt I made to trust again. Meanwhile, she disappeared. Didn't call. Didn't write. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of pride. Or maybe because she thought I was still there, waiting, hurt, available. But I wasn't. I was rebuilding what was left of me. Until one day, months later, she appeared. She saw me with someone else. She saw us laughing together, sharing the kind of intimacy that was once just ours. And she noticed. Not by the kiss, or the touch. But by the lightness. By the way my eyes were free, how genuine my smile was. She realized I was no longer hers. And that was the hardest blow she could have received. Because betrayal is regretted. But loss is mourned. And she lost. She came to me later. She asked to talk. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd gotten confused, that she thought it was just a phase. That she didn't want to lose me. That she realized it too late. That the other guy wasn't what she imagined. That he didn't want commitment. That he'd disappeared. That he'd left her alone. That, in the end, all she wanted was to come back. I listened. Calmly. With my heart already in another place. I said I forgave her. Because yes, forgiveness is necessary to move on. But I made it clear that forgiveness isn't an invitation back. It's not a rescue of history. It's just the missing full stop. And that now I was at peace. She cried. And for the first time, I didn't cry with her. Today we go our separate ways. And I finally found peace in the arms of someone who understands that loyalty isn't an obligation, it's a choice. Someone who doesn't lie when they look into my eyes. Someone who knows the difference between love and desire. Someone who chooses every day to stay, even when it would be easier to leave. And she understood, too late, that some choices can't be taken back. That there are gestures that never fade. That there are loves you only experience once. And that, when you lose someone, it's not the other person who leaves, it's your heart that closes the door. But fate has its ironies. Because, weeks later, chance brought us face to face again. A random coffee. A random morning. Me coming in, her leaving. Alone. She saw me. And smiled, awkwardly. I smiled back, politely. And I held the hand of the person next to me. There was no conversation. There was no hug. There was just a look. And in that look, an abyss of everything we were, of what we are no longer, and of what we will never be again. She passed. I remained. And for the first time, pain didn't visit me. Only certainty. The certainty that some stories need to end, so that we can begin to write others where we are not just loved, we are chosen. But what happened after that coffee? What did she do with everything that was left? And how did I know, definitively, that she truly understood the weight of the choice she made? The answer lies in the details of what came next. In the silences. In the gestures. And in one final scene, that none of us will ever forget. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not romance, it is destruction. The stories you will hear are fiction, but the feelings are real. Our goal is clear, to show how betrayal, however seductive it may seem, shatters what matters most: love, trust, and respect. Get ready. What's coming next is a story strong, true in emotions and with a lesson that will stay with you until the end. Press play. The truth doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers, and destroys in silence. When Daniel met Clara, it was on an uneventful afternoon, in a small cafe tucked away between busy streets where he often wandered to escape the noise of the world. She was sitting at a table in the back, reading a random book with headphones on and a half-empty cup of coffee, as if time didn't exist. Daniel wasn't one to believe in coincidences, but there was something about that moment, a quick exchange of glances, an involuntary smile, a kind of unexpected familiarity, that made him think that perhaps some people were meant to be in our lives even when we're not looking for them. He was coming out of a turbulent period, the wreckage of a relationship that ended without warning and left him with a certain skepticism about love. But Clara didn't need to prove anything. She simply existed with a silent lightness that, little by little, washed away all the memories that still lingered. Clara had a subtle way of taking up space, as if she didn't ask permission but didn't invade either. Her laugh was light, her gaze always attentive to the fine print, as if she saw more than she was saying. She worked as a graphic designer at a publishing house and spent her days amid creative projects and bitter coffees, nurturing dreams she'd never admit aloud. Daniel, on the other hand, was a CFO at a mid-sized company, accustomed to spreadsheets, goals, and the pragmatism of firm decisions. But just being by her side reminded him that there was more than goals and deadlines, that there was respite amidst the chaos, that there was life beyond control. They complemented each other without forcing it. There was no effort in being together. And for a time, this simplicity was enough. They dated for 2 years before deciding to move in together. The apartment wasn't large, but it had a large window in the living room with a sunset view and walls they'd painted themselves over a weekend filled with face paint, cheap wine, and loud music. Friends said they were the kind of couple who seemed to function in silence, who spoke with their eyes, who knew how to share space without losing their individuality. On birthdays, Clara prepared surprises, hand-wrote cards, and organized intimate dinners, and Daniel, even though he wasn't the classic romantic type, made a point of learning to cook her favorite dish, just to see her smile. On Sundays, they had a ritual of doing nothing. They stayed in bed late, talking about life, the future, their fear of getting old, their desire for a dog, and perhaps someday, thinking about having children. Their life together was full of routine, but it was a routine they built with care. Clara was methodical about some things. She liked the towel folded a specific way, couldn't stand it when Daniel left his socks on the couch, and hated any kind of delay. Daniel, on the other hand, was more relaxed, more distracted by details, but always present in the important moments. They learned from each other. There were arguments, of course, as in any real relationship, but they both had an almost mature ability to resolve them without exploding, to talk without hurting. On difficult days, Daniel knew when to keep quiet, Clara knew when to approach. They were good for each other, and this was evident even in the smallest gestures, the way she straightened his tie before leaving, or the way he put a blanket over her on cold mornings. It was love, and it was also coexistence, choice, commitment. Clara's parents had been separated for years, so she was always wary of repeating stories. Daniel, on the other hand, came from a structured family, the kind that still ate dinner together on Sundays and called each other to check if the other person ate well. He appreciated this and tried to bring this same sense of care to their relationship. Over time, Clara adapted to his ways, just as he also began to understand her silences, the insecurities that surfaced from time to time, her need to feel admired, validated. It wasn't vanity, it was fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of becoming invisible. They were married in a simple garden, with few guests and a clear sky that seemed painted just for that afternoon. Their vows were said with choked voices and unshed tears. Daniel held her hand tightly and spoke as if each word were an irrefutable promise. Clara smiled and, for the first time in her life, seemed to believe that forever could exist, as long as it was with him. After the ceremony, they headed for the coast. They rented a small, unpretentious house, but with a balcony overlooking the sea. They spent days oblivious to the world, turning off their cell phones, walking hand in hand on the sand, and speaking little, not because they lacked words, but because they overflowed with emotion. Over the following months, their life as a couple began to adjust to this new phase. Clara began taking on more freelance projects, wanting to feel more professionally fulfilled and independent. Daniel, for his part, took on a new challenge within the company, which required more hours and more focus. Their time together became a little scarcer, but they still maintained small rituals. They had dinner together whenever they could. They watched series on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. On Fridays, Clara would prepare a new recipe, and Daniel would bring wine. It was their way of remembering they were still there, they were still the two of them. But little by little, some small changes began to happen. Clara seemed more restless, more distant at times. She said she was tired, overwhelmed. He avoided certain topics, his moods changed more easily. Daniel understood, of course, but didn't know exactly what to do. He thought it was a phase. That she was going through some personal crisis and that everything would resolve itself in time. He decided to give her space. He encouraged her to go on a solo trip for a weekend, offered to help with her projects, and tried to be more present even when exhaustion was looming. But Clara, while grateful, seemed aloof. It wasn't coldness. It was as if her mind was elsewhere all the time. Friends noticed the change. Dinners as a couple began to be cancelled. Meetups with mutual friends became more rare. Clara no longer responded to group chats, Daniel gave vague excuses. There was an awkward atmosphere, but no one talked about it. Because everyone knew them as the couple that worked, and no one wanted to admit that something was breaking down. And deep down, Daniel still believed everything would go back to the way it was. He was making plans for their upcoming wedding anniversary. He thought about traveling, maybe redoing their honeymoon. He started secretly saving money to surprise her with a new ring, the kind with personalized engravings. He didn't just want to remember their love, he wanted to win it back. Show her it was still worth it. That it was still possible. Even without saying it out loud, even without admitting there was something missing. Because love, for him, has always been this, staying even when it would be easier to give up. Clara, on the other hand, became increasingly withdrawn. She didn't fight, she didn't argue. But she also stopped complimenting. She didn't touch with gratuitous affection. She didn't look into his eyes with the same warmth. When Daniel arrived, she left the room. When he tried to talk, she responded with short answers. It was as if she were only physically present, while emotionally withdrawing a little each day. Still, they kept up appearances. Occasional photos on social media, smiles at work dinners, automatic pleasantries at family gatherings. But between those four walls, there was a deafening silence. An absence that hurt more than any scream. Daniel, trying to maintain his composure, pretended not to see. Because admitting it would mean accepting that he was losing someone he still loved. And deep down, he believed that loving also meant enduring. Time passed. The house remained tidy, the dishes were washed, the bills were divided, the chores were completed. But his heart no longer beat in sync. And yet, he kept trying. Because when Daniel promised love, he didn't just promise it in the happy times. He promised it on the cloudy days too. And he believed that Clara was still there, somewhere behind the coldness, waiting to be rescued from herself. What he didn't know, and didn't even suspect, was that history was already heading toward a point of no return. A point where love, respect, and truth would be cruelly tested. A point where silence would cease to be protection and become a sentence. And everything he believed about love, loyalty, and forgiveness would be challenged. But, at that moment, he didn't know yet. There was still hope in his gestures. There was still faith in his eyes. And, even though something was already crumbling, he insisted on rebuilding, unaware that someone, on the other side, had already abandoned the project. Daniel began to notice the small deviations more clearly on a seemingly ordinary Wednesday. Clara had left early, saying she had a meeting with a client out of town, something about a new visual identity proposal for a cosmetics brand. It was the kind of job that came up occasionally, and he saw no reason to be suspicious. But that afternoon, returning home early after a cancelled meeting, he noticed her car was still in the garage. At first, he thought perhaps she'd returned due to an unexpected event, forgotten something, or had a change of plans. He climbed the stairs slowly, briefcase still in hand, and upon entering, he heard no sound. No movement. The house was completely silent. He called her name twice and received no response. He went to the bedroom and found it just as they'd left it that morning, only a little more messy. Nothing seemed out of place, except for an uneasy feeling growing inside him with no concrete explanation. It was only upon entering the office that he noticed the freshly used coffee cup on the table, still steaming, and her scarf thrown over the chair. No sign of work. Just a presence that didn't make sense given the absence she'd claimed. He didn't ask anything that night. He just watched Clara act normally, as if the day had unfolded exactly as she described. But at that moment, something stirred within him. The trust, so solid, began to silently crack. In the following days, Daniel began to pay closer attention to details he'd previously ignored. He began to notice that Clara carried her phone everywhere, including to the bathroom, and that her messages were always muted. Sometimes he'd catch her looking at the screen with a small smile, and when he approached, she'd quickly switch apps. There were times when she seemed completely disconnected from the house, oblivious to the day's affairs, responding automatically. When he asked her something, she was slow to react, as if her mind was always occupied by something unrelated to him. Still, Daniel tried to maintain his balance. He made breakfast as usual, texted her throughout the day, suggested dinners, short trips, but she'd decline with some plausible justification. He began to live between denial and discomfort, trying to avoid jumping to conclusions while feeling the ground slowly shift beneath his feet. One night, while Clara slept, Daniel got up to get water and saw her phone flashing on the bedside table. It was a message notification with a name he'd never seen before. A neutral, common name, but it immediately sparked unease. He hesitated. He'd never invaded her privacy. Never needed to. But instinct prevailed. He grabbed her phone, but it had a password. He didn't try to figure it out. He simply put it back, but he slept little that night. And the following nights became worse. Daniel began to lose his appetite, avoided going out with friends, and at work, his performance declined. He was in a constant state of alert, trying to piece together loose pieces of a puzzle he wasn't even sure he wanted to complete. Until one afternoon, while returning from the supermarket, he saw Clara leaving a restaurant downtown. She wasn't alone. She was accompanied by someone. A tall man, shirt tucked into his arms, an easy smile. They were leaving laughing, too close. They didn't actually touch, but there was something in their body language that hurt more than an explicit hug. Daniel stopped the car a few meters away, his hands trembling, his heart racing. He wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that it could be a friend, a coworker. But something about the way she looked at him, the way she turned her head to laugh at something he said, was all too familiar. It was the look she'd given him once. She left unseen. She said nothing that night. Or the next. He kept the weight of the image to himself, and for the first time, he felt he was facing something real. In the days that followed, Daniel began to observe Clara's schedule more closely. He noticed she returned later on Mondays and Wednesdays, days when she claimed to have external meetings. He began to leave questions unanswered, trying to observe her reactions, her eyes, her hands, her body. Clara responded as calmly as ever, but now there was a slight discomfort in the back of her voice. And the more he tried to get closer, the further she retreated. Until one Saturday, while rummaging through one of the living room drawers looking for a charger, Daniel found an open gift box with a men's watch inside, still with the tag on. It wasn't his birthday. There was no anniversary. And when he asked, Clara hesitated. She said it was for a friend's brother, made up a name, an excuse too weak to be convincing. He simply nodded, but inside, the pain gripped him tightly. It was then that he decided to confirm. With the help of a childhood friend, he began discreetly investigating. Not for revenge, but for sanity. He needed to know if he was going crazy or if his intuition was right. And unfortunately, he was. The messages came first, captured by simple software. Then came the photos. Lunches, discreet coffee dates, quick outings after work. Everything meticulously hidden by Clara, who still slept beside him every night as if nothing were happening. Daniel didn't cry. Not then. He only felt a sharp chill spread through his body. A mixture of anger, sadness, and a dull shame at having been deceived in his own home. But he didn't scream, didn't confront, didn't break anything. You simply withdrew emotionally. In the following days, he began to observe her with new eyes. Every gesture, every word, every excuse now carried a new weight. And with this renewed perspective, he realized she wasn't the same either. Clara wore more makeup, spent more time in front of the mirror, wore different clothes, and perfumed herself with fragrances she hadn't used often before. Her laughter, once rare, now escaped more easily, but not to him. Daniel realized he had lost not only his marriage, but the intimacy, the complicity, the exclusivity of being someone's safe place. Even so, he acted with dignity. He began to pack his things little by little, calmly planning his exit. He wouldn't make a scene. He wanted to leave gracefully, even while bleeding inside. Then the invitation to the company dinner arrived. A formal event, all couples invited, a night of celebration, speeches, and toasts. Clara suggested they go together, saying it would be important to keep up appearances. Daniel, calm, accepted. Deep down, he knew it would be the last time they would be side by side under the same social roof. It was there that he would choose the end. And he spent days preparing the letter. A precise, elegant, hate-free letter. He wrote and rewrote. He considered each sentence as if he were crafting a goodbye that needed to be remembered not for its scandal, but for its silent impact. On the night of the dinner, Daniel donned his best suit, shaved carefully, and perfumed himself with the same scent he'd worn on his wedding day. Clara, stunning, wore a dress he'd never seen before. He said it was new, bought especially for that night. She smiled more than usual. She chatted with everyone, as if she were at the height of something that no longer included him. They sat at separate tables, as was customary at the event. He watched her from afar, with the look of someone who already knew too much. And when she approached to find him, asking him to come to her table for a toast with colleagues, he smiled. He walked over. He placed the envelope between their glasses, removed the ring from his finger, and placed it next to her glass. She looked at him, confused. He simply said, in a low, firm voice, "Now you can toast to the freedom you've been searching for," and turned away. He left without haste, leaving behind not just a marriage, but a story that, even though it had ended, deserved a worthy ending. As she walked outside, the sound of silverware stopped for a few seconds. And in that brief silence, Clara knew something inside her had been ripped beyond repair. The envelope still in her hands weighed more than any argument she could muster. As she opened the letter, her eyes filled with tears, not from shame, but from the way she'd been exposed without a single harsh word. And in that moment, between shock and denial, her lover looked away, uncomfortable. Nothing was said between them. There was nothing to say. Only the realization that everything had been discovered. Everything except one detail. A detail Daniel still kept hidden. A detail that would change the course of everything they thought they knew until that moment. A detail that would be revealed very soon. In the days following dinner, Clara disappeared from view. No message, no call, no attempt at explanation or direct contact. The silence, which had previously hurt Daniel, now only confirmed everything. She had made her choice, and he, his. The house remained untouched for a few weeks until he decided to gather his last belongings. He had moved to a smaller, simpler, but peaceful apartment. Her scent was no longer on the pillows, nor the echo of her footsteps shuffling down the hallway. The new home was silent, but not suffocating. It was his, whole. He no longer needed to mince words, nor smiles, nor his pain. He began to rebuild his habits, his routine, and over time, even his own reflection looked different in the mirror. More solid, more serene, more whole. What remained of him after the fall was, strangely, what had always been there, but now free of illusions. Clara, however, faced a much crueler mirror. The first few days after dinner were spent escaping. She spent nights at a friend's house, crying silently, unable to even explain what she felt. It wasn't just regret. It was the weight of silent contempt. Daniel's gaze, which held no resentment, but a kind of indifference that was more heartbreaking than any anger. Her lover, who had once seemed like a haven of escape, no longer displayed the same likeness. After dinner, he walked away as easily as he'd entered. He said he didn't want to get involved in that kind of situation, that he didn't want to be the other in anyone's story, and that she had taken it too far. It was clear he was more concerned with his own reputation than with any feelings she might have. And the last thing he said to Clara before leaving was that she needed to sort out her mess on her own. Clara, suddenly, had no one. Days turned into weeks, and inevitably, she decided to look for Daniel. She showed up at the entrance of the new building unannounced, her hair tied up haphazardly, her face drawn, and the tired eyes of someone who hadn't slept. Daniel was coming home from work, saw her name on the intercom, and hesitated for a few seconds. But he answered. He went downstairs. He opened the gate without saying anything and stopped in front of her. The silence was a body between them. Clara tried to smile, but failed. She asked to talk, said she needed 5 minutes. He led her to the sidewalk, without inviting her up. They stood there, surrounded by passing cars and people who didn't know what was happening between them. She took a deep breath before saying anything. She began by talking about how sorry she was, how she'd let herself be overcome by a moment of doubt, how she hadn't expected him to find out that way, but now she saw clearly the enormity of her mistake. She spoke between long pauses, as if the air wasn't enough to sustain each word. She said she'd lost the only man who truly knew her, who understood her in silence, who built a future with her without needing to make promises. Daniel just listened. His face calm but distant. He didn't interrupt. He didn't confirm. He didn't react. And that made her tremble inside. Until, with a broken voice, she said she wanted to go back. That she was willing to start over. That she knew she didn't deserve it, but that if he accepted, she would do everything differently. At that moment, Daniel looked at her deeply for the first time. The silence stretched, long, heavy. And then, he responded quietly but firmly. He said he forgave her. Because he needed to let go of the resentment. But there was no going back. Because the love that existed there had died the moment she decided to put someone else between them. She said that what she had destroyed wasn't just his trust, but her own. And that now, as much as she wanted to be, she was no longer a part of his life. Clara tried to justify herself, cried, and held onto his arm, but he gently let go and said only that the cycle had to end there. That moving on was her only choice. She left without knowing what hurt more, the end or the fact that he was calm. Because Daniel didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't cry. He simply wasn't there anymore. And that kind of absence was unbearable. The following days were a failed effort to move on. She tried to resume projects, reconnect with friends, return to a rhythm of life that no longer made sense. Because everything now revolved around the emptiness she herself had created. She wasn't a victim. And that ate away at her. Weeks later, chance brought another wound. Clara walked into an old cafe in the city, a place she used to frequent with Daniel. She hadn't been there in a while, perhaps to avoid memories. But that afternoon, something drew her there. I wanted to escape the world for a few minutes. When he opened the door, the bell rang as always. She walked to the counter and then stopped. In the right corner, at the same table where they usually sat, was Daniel. He was laughing with someone. A woman. Light brown hair, a calm gaze, a sincere laugh. She wasn't exuberant. She was serene. And there was a naturalness between them that hurt. Clara couldn't look away. Daniel saw her. He stopped laughing for a moment. Their eyes met. And he simply nodded politely. A brief, neutral, almost fraternal smile. Then he returned to his conversation with the woman in front of him as if Clara were just another old memory not worth rehashing. She stood there, frozen. Her chest tightened. Heat rose in her face. She left without asking for anything. She cried in the car. Not out of jealousy. Not because of the image of him with someone else. But because, for the first time, she understood that he hadn't just forgiven her, he had moved on. And that was something she could never undo. Days later, driven by an impulse mixed with pain, Clara wrote a letter. The letter she should have written before she made her mistake. A genuine apology. Not with the intention of winning him back, but of redemption. A letter that spoke of everything she felt, of how she lost herself trying to find something outside that had always existed within. About how she sought validation in the wrong hands and destroyed everything that truly mattered. About how she had learned, the hard way, that love cannot tolerate repeated lies. She left the letter in the lobby of his building, nameless, with the simple certainty that if he read it, he would understand. But Daniel didn't answer. And he didn't need to. Because the greatest answer had already been given in that cafe. He didn't hate. He didn't ignore. He didn't deny the past. But he had understood that certain wounds, even healed, leave scars that never allow one to return to the same place. Time passed. Clara learned to deal with the pain, the guilt, the looks of those who knew. She tried to rebuild her life. But nothing had the same lightness. Nothing had the same depth. Because Daniel was more than a partner. He was home. He was peace. And when she chose to leave, she didn't realize that some doors, once closed, never open again. But fate still had one last surprise in store. Something she could never have foreseen. A secret that wasn't revealed at dinner, nor in the letter, nor in the silent encounters that followed. Something that, if revealed, would make everything even clearer. And would show that, in the end, the consequences of her choice would go far beyond what she imagined. Far beyond what she was prepared to bear. A few weeks later, in the middle of autumn, when the leaves piled up on the sidewalks as if time insisted on visually recording everything that fell and never returned, Clara decided, for the last time, to seek out Daniel. There was no promise of reconciliation or return. She knew that. What remained now was not an attempt to win back his love, but perhaps to restore some semblance of humanity between them, some shred of dignity. She wanted to talk, to let out something that was silently eating away at her. And she knew he deserved to hear it, not because it was necessary for him, but because, in a way, the truth always exacts its price. And she knew there was still a part of the story that had never been told, something Daniel had never discovered, and that might change everything, or perhaps just put an end to what once was. Their reunion took place in a park, on a mild Saturday afternoon. Clara had sent a direct and to-the-point message, "I need to tell you something. I'm not looking to get back together, but I don't want to carry this alone." Daniel accepted, with the same sobriety as ever. When she arrived, he was already there. Sitting on a bench, wearing dark jeans, a gray t-shirt, and the same look that now no longer expressed his feelings, but rather observed. Clara approached slowly, sat beside him, and for a few seconds, neither of them said a word. The distant sound of children playing and birds echoed like a soundtrack too delicate for the tension that hung between them. She took a deep breath and began. She said that, first of all, he needed to understand that what she was about to reveal wasn't an excuse, nor a disguised apology. It was simply the truth. Something she'd hidden out of fear. And now there was no point in keeping it. Daniel remained silent. Clara then began to tell her story. She said that, months before the betrayal happened, on a day when he had left for a business trip, she'd run into a familiar face in a bookstore. It was the same man who, years before, had been her childhood crush. Someone she'd known even before Daniel entered her life, an unresolved love that had been suspended in time, interrupted by immature decisions, but somehow never completely buried. She said the reunion was initially innocent, a coffee, a quick chat. But there, in that unpretentious encounter, she felt something rekindle within her. It wasn't love, she said honestly, but the dangerous taste of what was left unfinished. And it was this feeling that unhinged her. She said she wasn't looking for a second chance with the past, but rather wanted to understand why that reunion had shaken her so. And in the process of trying to understand, she began to distance herself emotionally from the present. That's how she began to distance herself from Daniel, to act indifferently, to search outside for an excuse that might explain the emptiness growing inside her. But then, she said, came the worst part. There was a night, a few weeks before the company dinner, when she and her former love met again, and he, already weakened by a recent separation, talked about everything that could have been between them if time hadn't taken everything. It was an intense conversation, full of distorted memories, romanticizations of an idealized past. Clear, confused, and vulnerable, she fell into the emotional trap of that moment. They slept together. Not out of passion, but to escape. And it was in that moment that everything shattered inside her. She knew it wasn't love. She knew there was nothing real there. But it was too late. Too late to go back and still be who she was for Daniel. Too late to rescue the woman he loved. Daniel continued listening. His gaze was steady, his jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. Clara then paused for a long time. The words that were to come seemed to hurt more than anything else she had said so far. She said that the morning after that night, as she was driving home with her heart in tatters, she logged into her email and found a message Daniel had scheduled to be sent that day. It was a hotel reservation confirmation for a special weekend, at a place they had planned to go months before, with a note from the reservation system, "Wedding anniversary, room with a view, please." Clara froze. She said she read it sitting on the couch, her body still carrying the scent of another man. And it was there, on that silent morning, that she understood the depth of the abyss she had created. She said what destroyed their marriage wasn't the betrayal itself, but the disregard she felt for the little things he did, even when she was no longer the same. And that, after that, she didn't have the courage to confess. She just kept pretending, hoping he'd figure it out on his own. And he did. But not everything. Daniel stared straight ahead. He said nothing for a while. He seemed to process the information like someone who already knew it hurt, yet was still surprised by how deeply it cut. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost monotone, but there was a firm weight to each word. He said he already knew about the betrayal, knew about the encounters, even knew the other man's face. But he didn't know, and this was what hurt him most, that she saw him still trying. That she read that reserve. That she had the chance to choose to go back, to stop, and yet she still went ahead. Daniel said that this, more than any physical act, was what killed him inside. Her lack of hesitation. Her silence in the face of his attempt to love again. Clara was crying now, without restraint. She said she hated having been weak, that she would regret for the rest of her life having confused intensity with truth. She said that if she could go back, she would choose to talk, face the crisis, open her heart. But now she knew there was no way to undo what was said with actions. Daniel watched her with teary eyes, but he didn't cry. He said that understanding all of this now didn't change the past, but it did explain the whole left. He said there was no longer anger, but a scar that throbbed every time he remembered where everything could have ended if she had only spoken the truth when there was still time. The sun began to set slowly. The orange light of late afternoon tinged their faces with an inevitable melancholy. Clara held her hands as if they could stop the world from falling apart. Daniel then stood. He looked at her for a few seconds and told her that this was the last time. That he was grateful for telling her, that he wanted her to move on, to forgive herself. But now he needed to experience something new. Something clean. Something that wouldn't have to be rebuilt on ruins. She nodded, too weak for words. He turned and left. Clara stood there. Alone. For the second time, she watched Daniel leave. But this time, unlike dinner, it wasn't just an exit. It was an ending she herself confirmed with every word she spoke. And as she watched him walk away, she finally understood that the true punishment for betrayal wasn't the end of the relationship. It was seeing the other person find peace, love, and dignity, while she would forever carry the memory of what she destroyed by failing to appreciate it while it still existed. And what Daniel never knew, and perhaps never needed to know, is that, days after that reunion in the park, Clara returned to the bookstore where everything had begun again. She sat in the same cafe, ordered the same tea, and stared out the window for almost an hour. When she left an envelope on the counter. Inside was a printed, unsigned text. A rant. A regret. A confession. The title was simple, "The Day I Betrayed the Only Person Who Truly Loved Me." And there, between the lines, she immortalized the only thing she could still do, transform the pain into memory, so that she would never again forget how hard it is to lose a true love for choices that seemed harmless at first, but which carry consequences that no apology can erase. The days following their encounter in the park seemed to move at different speeds for each of them. Clara began to walk as if dragging her own body, her shoulders hunched not by the weight of bags or commitments, but by a more invisible, cruel burden. There was an exhaustion in her gaze that wasn't physical. A kind of nameless emptiness, as if words had lost their purpose in the face of the final silence she heard that afternoon. She would wake late, her eyes heavy from a restless sleep, stare at the ceiling for long minutes, and remain there, between sleep and regret, trying to understand how one reaches the point of destroying the only thing that made sense. On the days she could get up, she avoided the places they frequented together, but she couldn't avoid the thoughts that took her to those same places, now haunted by memories of a happiness she couldn't preserve. Every corner of the city held a memory of her with him, and the cruelest thing was that, even in the happy memories, there was now pain. Daniel, despite his demonstrated serenity, was also facing his own kind of grief. But it was different. His was a guilt-free grief, the grief of someone who did everything they could and still had to accept the loss. The difference was in the weight. While Clara wallowed in guilt, Daniel fluctuated between phases of starting over. He had good days and not so good ones. At times, he still felt her absence in his automatic gestures, like making 2 cups of coffee without realizing it or searching for a familiar perfume in the supermarket aisle, but instead of anger, what he felt was an honest longing for the good times he had experienced. He no longer held a grudge. He had overcome the indignation phase. The pain was no longer a dagger in his chest, it was just a scar that burned with the cold wind of memory. During this time, his connection with Anna, the woman he'd been seen with at the cafe, began to deepen. It wasn't an overwhelming love, the kind that comes like a storm. It was something slow, gentle, like a tide that rises slowly and, before you know it, has already washed over everything around it. Anna was different. She had her own pace. She never asked Daniel to forget the past, never demanded space, simply being present when he needed it and respecting his silence when the world weighed on her. She understood that true love isn't imposed, it's offered. And it was in this atmosphere of lightness and emotional maturity that he finally began to rebuild his idea of a relationship. But while Daniel was starting over, Clara was plunged into the deepest dilemma of her life. Her friends began to drift away, some unsure of how to handle the situation, others judging her choices. At work, she no longer produced with the same clarity and creativity. Her mind was always absent, distracted by possibilities that hadn't materialized. At home, the silence was even denser. No song sounded right. No series held her attention. No conversation was enough. It was as if her life had entered a state of waiting that she couldn't end. The worst part wasn't the regret itself, but the fact that it wasn't accompanied by the possibility of repair. She wanted to go back in time. She wanted to scream at the version of herself that believed she could play with risk and come out unscathed. But time, that merciless judge, just watched. It was on one of those gray afternoons that Clara found herself sitting before a blank sheet of paper once again. It wasn't just another letter to Daniel. It was a kind of confession to herself. An attempt to face herself as she was, without filters, without excuses, without the self-deception that had plagued her for so long. She wrote about her insecurities, about the fear of being ordinary, about vanity disguised as freedom, about the absurd feeling of being trapped even when she was with someone who loved her deeply. She said her greatest mistake was confusing the boredom of stability with the absence of love. That she thought she needed to rediscover herself, but she chose the most destructive path. And that, in trying to prove something to herself, she ended up giving up the only certainty she had. Meanwhile, Daniel continued on. He had decided to travel with Anna. A short trip, to a rural area where he could disconnect from the world for a while. It was one of those getaways he used to dream of taking with Clara, but which were always postponed. And now, even with memories intertwined, he decided not to let the past prevent him from living in the present. The road was quiet, Anna played soft music on the radio, and the two spoke unhurriedly, as if each word were a seed thrown into the wind. Daniel didn't talk about Clara. And Anna never asked. Because they knew there was no need to force closure. Every silence said more than any explanation. And, for the first time in a long time, he slept away from home without waking in the middle of the night. It was a sign of healing. Back in the city, Clara was invited by a former colleague to speak at a small design and creativity event. It was a simple invitation, but she accepted. You needed to reconnect with something that made sense. During the presentation, he talked about processes, visual identity, and creative intuition. But, without realizing it, he began to delve into a more emotional realm. He said that sometimes the greatest ruptures come from within. That destroying one's own project is easier than taking responsibility for it. And in the end, when everyone applauded, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, recognition. Not for being someone's ex. But for being herself. Even hurt. Even stained by bad choices, there was still something valuable inside. In the following days, Clara began to rebuild herself silently. Not as someone who expects forgiveness. But as someone who accepts that life goes on, even with mistakes. She began to study more, write more, reconnect with people who didn't know her solely for her failure. She tried to remember who she was before losing herself in that relationship. And, curiously, she found peace in unexpected places, in helping an elderly neighbor with groceries, in adopting a rescue puppy, in teaching design to vulnerable teenagers. The pain was still there, but now she lived with a sense of active responsibility. She couldn't change the past. But she could prevent it from being the only thing that defined her. The moral dilemma that haunted her, however, was not small. It was constant. Clara still wondered if she deserved to be happy. If it was fair, to her and to the world, to find peace after having caused so much suffering. And perhaps that was the big question that no ready-made answer could resolve. What to do with the guilt that lingers even after asking for forgiveness? How to continue living when you know you've destroyed something precious? There were days when she almost called Daniel, just to hear his voice. But she held back the urge. She knew it wasn't fair. That he now had someone. Someone who probably slept peacefully beside him. And that thought, though harsh, helped her remember that there were consequences that needed to be respected. Daniel, on the other hand, was now reflecting on something he hadn't expected: what to do with the good memories. He didn't want to erase Clara. Because erasing her would also deny the sincere moments they'd shared. But he also didn't want to harbor dangerous nostalgia. He learned to remember lightly, like someone leafing through an old album and smiling at the longing without drowning in it. He had learned that true love isn't just about building, but also about knowing how to say goodbye respectfully. With Anna, he experienced something different. Less intense, perhaps, but more conscious. You didn't need to prove anything. Just be there. And that, after all, was enough. Life went on. Each on their own path. Clara, rebuilding pieces. Daniel, forging new paths. But something remained between them, like an invisible thread that didn't demand reconnection, but just one last stitch. One last gesture. One last chance to, perhaps, look into each other's eyes and acknowledge that, despite the damage, there was something that resisted the ruin, the truth. And that, however painful, was all that remained. And it's at this point in the story that everything approaches a conclusion. Because time, with its cruel patience, always finds a way to reunite paths that still have something to say. And when that happens, when their eyes meet one last time, it won't be to relive, but to bring closure. And to show that forgiveness isn't always a new beginning, sometimes, it's just a beautiful way to say goodbye. Autumn crept in unbidden, tinging the streets with golden hues and a constant chill that forced coats and longer silences. It was as if time knew what was happening inside each of them and decided to translate the landscape into metaphor. Daniel, now immersed in his new life, with a lighter routine and a companion who didn't require emotional bandages, had distanced himself from everything that reminded him of his old relationship. He'd changed his route to work, altered his gym schedule, and even chosen a new bookstore to frequent, even if it meant missing his favorite authors. All for a simple reason: to leave no trace. But the past, even though it was no longer an active part of his life, wasn't easily erased. It was present in occasional dreams, in certain songs that insisted on playing in public places, in the lingering glances of strangers who seemed to remind him of something he couldn't explain. Clara, after months immersed in a profound internal process of reflection and pain, began to allow new forms of life to infiltrate the gaps in her existence. It wasn't exactly happiness, or even peace, but there was a distinct stillness, like someone learning to walk among ruins and, little by little, beginning to plant small flowers among the rubble. Her days were still filled with involuntary memories, but she had stopped running from them. Now, she faced each memory as if cleaning a wound, gently, but without lies. It was during this process that she decided, for the first time in a long time, to accept an invitation to an informal dinner with former colleagues. It would be at a newly opened art gallery, a new place, a different audience, and it gave her the feeling of a small new beginning. Upon arriving, her eyes still searched for familiar faces, but they also avoided the urge to look for one she knew wouldn't be there. Daniel also received the same invitation, but declined. Not for lack of interest, but because he had other plans with Anna that night, an outdoor jazz festival, something she always talked about with enthusiasm. He watched her as she got ready, her hair loose, her lipstick bright, her almost childlike enthusiasm for something so simple. It made him smile genuinely, because there was beauty in seeing someone happy with so little. On the way to the event, the two talked about travel, books, and short-term plans. Anna mentioned the idea of opening a small music school for children, and Daniel, for the first time, offered help, not just financial, but practical. He was involved. Present. With her, he learned to offer without the weight of expectation. And that made him realize he was finally whole. Not divided. Not conflicted. Whole. At the gallery dinner, Clara reconnected with people she hadn't seen in a while. She received smiles, hugs, and a few awkward questions, all answered firmly. She realized it was possible to rebuild socially without having to justify every mistake with a mandatory forehead tattoo. At one point, a colleague invited her to see an art installation on the second floor. A series of abstract paintings explored the idea of rupture and reconstruction. One in particular caught her attention, an empty frame with a phrase written in small letters at the base: "Not everything that breaks needs to be fixed. Some things just need to be buried with respect." Clara stood there for a few minutes, alone. The phrase seemed to touch her in a way no therapy or confession had. And for the first time, she felt that perhaps closure didn't require reconciliation. Just understanding. Time continued to pass, and as happens in stories that draw to a close, a final encounter seemed inevitable. Not because of the script, but because some words only gain meaning when spoken with eye contact. It happened by chance, again. It was early December, a warm afternoon with a light breeze, and Daniel was with Anna at an end-of-year fair. Craft stalls, background music, children running with cotton candy, and couples scattered across the lawns. In one of the tents, Clara, who had joined a volunteer sustainable packaging design project, was participating as a guest. Her back was turned, organizing some labels, until she heard a familiar laugh. She turned slowly. Their eyes met. There was no shock, no rush, no hasty words. Just the awkward silence of those who recognize and respect the other's presence. Daniel smiled slightly, without letting Anna realize the magnitude of the moment. Clara smiled back, gently. And for a few seconds, everything seemed suspended. There was no more hurt. Just a story that, even with its flaws, didn't need to be erased. That night, Daniel returned home in silence. Anna noticed the change in his tone but didn't ask. Instead, she put on some light music and said she would make tea. He watched her in the kitchen, the fluidity of her movements, the naturalness with which she took care of the little things. He thought of Clara, but not with desire or longing. He thought with a kind of silent gratitude. Because, despite everything, she had been the bridge to that new path. He considered writing a letter. Not to send, but to himself. A record of the definitive closure. He sat at the table, opened the dark-covered notebook he kept for deeper thoughts, and began to write. He spoke of growth, of pain, of choices. He said he had learned that not all love survives the truth, and that sometimes true love lies in letting the other go without carrying a grudge. That forgiving wasn't forgetting, but accepting the place the story should occupy. Clara, for her part, spent the following days absorbing the impact of that brief reunion. She no longer felt the need to recover what she'd lost, but rather the responsibility to care for what was left of her after everything. One night, sitting on the couch with her son in her lap, she reread the old letters she'd written but never sent. She tore some up. She kept others. And with a pen, she wrote on the back of a sheet, "He was the most beautiful and most difficult lesson of my life. And I was the storm in his summer." He put it in a box, locked it, and put it in the back of the closet. Not like someone hiding something, but like someone deciding it's time to close a door. As December progressed, each of them forged new connections with life. Daniel began planning a longer trip with Anna, something more meaningful, perhaps abroad. Clara began teaching at a community college, and at the end of each class, she read a different text about choices. In one particular class, she read an excerpt from a little-known book that resonated with her own experience. Life always gives us chances to make the right choices, but only pain teaches us that every wrong choice has a cost that is sometimes eternal. The students listened in silence. She closed the book with a smile that blended regret and acceptance. It was December. The year was ending. And with it, the last remnants of a story that began with promises and ended in silence. But somehow, they had both managed to find a way to carry on. With scars, yes. But with dignity. And even if they would never again share the same table, the same roof, or the same future, there was a tacit agreement between them, that what they had experienced, however wounded, deserved to be remembered with respect. And that, in the end, the greatest love is perhaps precisely the one that knows when it's time to let go. Because holding on out of pride never saved anyone. But letting go with understanding, that is the true act of love. And with this understanding, they both moved on. Onward. But never in the same way. In the early days of the new year, as the city slowly returned to its routine, Daniel and Anna embarked on a short trip to the coast, where the sea crashed against the rocks with just the right force to reflect each person's inner state. It was a leisurely trip, without much planning, made for breathing. They walked along empty beaches at dusk, sharing long silences without the burden of needing to fill them. Daniel no longer carried the traces of what he had experienced, at least not in the same way. There was no longer any anger, not a shadow of bitterness. Only the clarity remained that love, when betrayed, can heal, but will never be the same. And yet, he had found something new, something that might not bring the same sparkle as it had at first, but brought a rare kind of peace. Anna watched him with understanding eyes, but without demanding. She knew that loving someone with a past requires patience, and she was willing. Not to heal him, but to accompany him. That time away from the city served to seal a phase. When they returned, Daniel made a decision. He proposed to Anna, without fanfare, without theatrical gestures, just with the exact right question at the right moment, over a cup of coffee in the morning. Anna said yes without hesitation. And in that moment, Daniel felt that, even though he had lost something immense in the past, he had gained something equally valuable in the present. It wasn't a fresh start. It was a new story. Clara received the news of the engagement from a mutual friend who, unaware of the weight of her words, shared it naturally. At first, Clara simply nodded, with a brief smile and her eyes fixed on a sheet of paper in front of her. Then, upon arriving home, she sat on the living room floor and remained there for a while, without crying, without reacting, just absorbing it. It wasn't a surprise. She knew it would come at some point. But hearing, tenderly, that he now belonged to another story definitively sealed the end of the illusion that one day they could be something again. She got up, walked around the house in silence, and, opening a drawer, found the last letter she had written to him and never had the courage to send. She read it again, with fresh eyes, and then burned it in the backyard, watching the words slowly turn to ash. It was her way of finally freeing not only him, but also herself from what had been and would never be again. In the following weeks, she immersed herself even more in the social projects she had embraced. She began dedicating part of her time to women who, like her, had lost themselves in broken relationships, unhealed traumas, and years of regret. She began using her story as an example, not as a heroine, but as someone who knew exactly the price of a wrong choice. She said out loud what had taken years to understand, that freedom is not the absence of commitment, but the courage to be true to those you love, and especially to who you are. Some people criticized her for exposing herself so much. Others embraced her with gratitude. But no opinion mattered more than her own. Because now, for the first time, she could say she was at peace with her pain. Not healed, but understood. And that made all the difference. At the end of that same year, Daniel and Anna were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by trees and people nearby, far from the public eye, with no appearances to maintain. During the vows, Daniel spoke of new beginnings and the human capacity to flourish even after storms. He spoke of the value of an honest word and how trust is the foundation that sustains anything true. Anna, her eyes brimming with tears, simply held his hand tightly and said she would be there for all the seasons, those that blossom and those that undress. It was a serene, intimate wedding, without pomp, but charged with a lightness that only those who have known pain can appreciate. Clara learned about the wedding online. She saw a photo posted by someone she didn't know, but who tagged a mutual friend. The image was simple, Daniel and Anna smiling, surrounded by dry leaves on the ground and lights strung between trees. She stared at the image for a few seconds, then turned off her phone and went for a walk. It was a cold night, but the air felt good. With each step, she mentally repeated a phrase she'd once heard in a lecture: "A few losses teach us more about love than 1,000 presences." And in that moment, she understood that the love Daniel offered her was what allowed him to learn to love someone even better after her. And even though it hurt, there was a lesson there that would carry with her forever. The years passed. Daniel became a father. Anna gave birth to a girl, and the name she chose was Helena, a combination of familiar names that represented new beginnings and strength. Daniel, holding his daughter for the first time, felt a kind of emotion he'd never known. It wasn't just love. It was responsibility, continuity, hope. And in that moment, he realized that everything he'd experienced before had made sense only to lead him to this point. He had truly forgiven himself, his old relationship, all the hurt. And now, he could teach his daughter, one day, that true love isn't about permanence, but about truth. And that betrayal, however tempting it may seem in a moment of doubt, is never worth what it costs later. Clara, for her part, never remarried. She had brief relationships, some intense, others calm, but none that led her to give herself completely again. Perhaps because, deep down, she didn't feel ready. Or perhaps because, even unconsciously, she always compared. Still, she lived with dignity. She became a reference in her professional field, received invitations to lecture in other cities, and began to be viewed with respect again. But most importantly, she began to respect herself again. She created a blog where she wrote chronicles about love, loss, and new beginnings. In one of them, she told her story with Daniel: no names, no hurt, no heroism. Just the truth. And this chronicle was shared thousands of times. People of all ages commented, were moved, and reflected. Because there was something there that the world recognizes as necessary: the courage to admit a mistake and the humility to not try to justify the unforgivable. The story ended not with grand gestures, nor with forced reunions, but with life following its natural course. Daniel, now a father, husband, and man at peace, wrote letters to his daughter that she would only read at 18. Clara, a reconstructed woman, chose to live with conscience and help others avoid making the same mistake. Each with their own truth. Each with their own journey. And so, their story didn't end in reconciliation, but in understanding. Because not all love is meant to last forever. But every betrayal leaves scars that, even when healed, change what we were forever. If you've made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. We want to hear your opinion, your perspective, and what you felt listening to this drama of love, loss, and forgiveness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Every week, a new narrative that makes you reflect and feel. And take this reflection with you: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys trust, families, dreams. It erases happy memories and rewrites entire futures. It rips the truth from the eyes of those who believed and replaces it with doubts that echo for years. So, never deceive yourself. No adventure is worth what true love can build over a lifetime. This channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any type of betrayal. Our purpose is to show, with each story, the weight of bad choices and the value of respect within any relationship. Until the next story.